Well, it's All Saints Sunday, which means it's all saints, living and dead. That's important to remember. Go back with me for just a little bit. 1999, and as the end of December began approaching, the news media started going wild. You probably remember this. They were looking at, because it made sense, all of the accomplishments, breakthrough accomplishments that were made in the 20th century before we were going to, enter into the 21st century. And so there were all kinds of comparisons and debates on TV over lots of stuff. And if you remember back then, some of the things that were mentioned, they talked about the breakthroughs in medical technologies, the breakthroughs in electronics, the breakthroughs in the automobile industry, just countless different kinds of breakthroughs. And it went from, this just sublime to maybe some of the even more ridiculous kind of stuff. They started comparing, athletes. Who was the best athlete of the 20th century? And as they began this debate, it became more and more heated as one particular name kept coming up and up at the top of the list. And the odd part about the continual and perpetual mentioning of that name was the fact it wasn't even a human name. It was a horse named Big Red, or we like to say Secretariat. Secretariat was interesting. Interesting because there hadn't been a Triple Crown winner for 25 years when Secretariat came onto the scene. And Big Red literally emerged out of total obscurity in 1973. You know how the Triple Crown is played. The Kentucky Derby is first up on the table. And so when Secretariat entered into the Kentucky Derby, the experts that day were saying, well, this is a pretty mediocre field. They had no expectations on any great things being done that day, although they felt it would be a fairly competitive race. As the bell went off and Secretariat tore into the first quarter, the announcers began realizing something special just might be happening. As Secretariat hit the first quarter, Secretariat was on record pace. The thoughts, though, that quickly emerged was, that horse will never keep up that pace. Second quarter, still at a record pace. Third quarter, still at a record pace. When Secretariat crossed the finish line, beat every other horse by 2.5 lengths, and set a record that still stands for the Kentucky Derby. Well, the next up is the Preakness. And of course, the build-up to the Preakness was, as you can imagine, huge. Because this horse had come out of nowhere and had set a record and was an imposing kind of horse. And so all the media had different kinds of comments. In fact, Time magazine even put on there, who is this horse? And so as the race began, the Belmont is a little different. The Preakness is a little different in the sense that the curves around the track are extremely sharp curves. When the bell went off that day, it was not Secretariat's best start. In fact, it's a terrible start. The horse was in the back of the field, but as they began approaching that first turn, Big Red started picking up speed, and it hit that first turn at full speed. And you think, well, what's so special about it? Experts will tell you when that race is run, all the jockeys slow their horses down when they're coming around the curves. Big Red hit it at full speed. Not only that one, but every single one of the turns, full speed. Crossed again, 2.5 lengths ahead of every other horse. And the experts said, noting the curves that Secretariat took, that is impossible for any horse to do. Now, the interesting thing was, Secretariat ran again a record pace. The double-edged lay short on this is that the official clock had a quirk, had a little failure, didn't exactly work right. And to this day, experts think that Secretariat actually holds the record for that particular race as well, too. A record based on the Preakness. However, with an official time clock gone bad, it's never been proven. The build-up for the Belmont Stakes was, as you can imagine, at a fever pitch. Now, what they tell us that day is pretty interesting stuff, is that morning when they got ready to take the horses out to walk them, that Secretariat stood up on its legs as it was being walked around on its hind quarters, on its hind legs, and pawed at the air. It was like a magical picture frozen in time. Nostrils flaring. Couldn't be contained. That day, Secretariat didn't walk up to the gate. It galloped up to the gate. When the bell went off, Secretariat took off and started leading the pack around the first. This is the longest race around the first bend. Quickly in the process, it was obvious this was going to be Secretariat's race and no one else's. Rose out in front of every single other horse. And as they were rounding about the halfway point with this huge lead, the announcers are going, what is this jockey doing? He needs to back this horse off. This horse is you're going to run it to death. You could give it an injury. I mean, you got the race. Back off of it a little bit. The interesting side note in all this, there was a horse during that first half that stayed toe-to-toe with Secretariat. That horse was named Sham. But as they rounded that first turn, Sham's legs gave out, could not keep up the pace. It was the last race Sham would ever win. On and on, Secretariat kept pursuing. When they asked the jockey, why did you ride Secretariat so hard? He simply gave this answer. He said, I did not push that horse one single bit. He said, I hung on to that horse for the entire race. He said, let me tell you, Secretariat ran that race out of sheer joy and delight in running. When that horse crossed the finish line, 31 lengths ahead of any other horse. Never been done before, never been done since. Oh yes, and the time 2:24, never been duplicated. Jack Nicklaus said it was the greatest performance, and I think Jack Nicklaus knows a little bit about good performances. Best athletic performance he'd ever seen in his entire life. What was the secret? Was it his size? I mean, he was a big horse. Statistics tell us he was 16.2 hands. But here's the oddity. There were other horses that were just as big or even bigger than Secretariat. And they never accomplished what Secretariat did. When Secretariat died, they did an autopsy. And what they discovered was Secretariat's heart was 2.5 times larger than an average horse's heart. It weighed a staggering 22 pounds. Put that in perspective. The average weight for the average racehorse's heart is 8.5 pounds. People who wrote about it said lots of things, but one comment stuck with me. The author of one article said this: Secretariat had been given a supernatural heart. Almighty God, the Creator, had given this special endowment and a greater capacity than any other racehorse in history. A supernatural heart given by God. It should be obvious to all of us here today that God's in the heart business. In fact, the best heart surgeon in the entire world is, God. And he's a specialist, by the way. He specializes in heart transplants. Don't believe me? Ezekiel 36:26. God talking. I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit in you. I will remove your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. Every Christian is a saint. And every saint who has accepted Jesus as Lord and Savior has been given a new heart. And this master surgeon does three things when he gives us a new heart. He removes, he gives, and puts the new heart in us. All God's work. But our part is that we must choose either to live out of the full capacity of our new heart or settle for living out of just a small portion of that new heart. The new heart that God gives us, my friends, is a large heart. And the Lord expects us to grow into the use of that heart. Our full use in our expanded hearts. God gives everyone in here, every saint, a supernatural heart, just like secretariats, for a greater capacity to run this race of life that we are all in a triumphant fashion. The Lord desires His saints to be big-hearted. What do you think of when you hear that term, big-hearted? I'll tell you what I think of right off the bat. Generous. People with big hearts run the race of life with a sense of extravagance. They are generous people who've learned that they can live out of those big hearts and understand that every one of us has access to unlimited supernatural resources. These are people who know they can afford to be generous. And so they are. They're generous with their compliments, with their forgiveness, with their mercy, and yes, indeed, with their encouragement and love to other people every day. Big-hearted saints run the race of life that we all run. But because they choose to grow into the full use of these expanded hearts that God has given them, their race seems almost effortless. They are able to run far ahead of those who attempt to run life's race with a smaller heart. Now, according to Paul, these expanded hearts that we have eyes. And so saints with big hearts have a generous view of life as they are running. Their vision around them and before them is as expanded as their hearts. They don't obsess and scrutinize over the little things in life. And they don't sweat the small stuff. Because from their viewpoint, it's all small stuff. They refuse to glare at the insignificant details in life. After all, the devil's in the details. Why focus on that? They would rather focus on the finish line. That's where they have raised and set their sights, not on the particulars, but the goal. There are saints who have had a heart transplant. They have had a new expanded heart put within them, but for some reason or another, they choose not to live and occupy all of that heart's territory. They are not big-hearted saints. are small-hearted saints. And as a consequence, they're not generous. Because they don't believe they have any access to any supernatural resources anywhere, anytime. They feel like they cannot afford to be generous with their compliments, or with their forgiveness, or with their mercy, or with their encouragement or their love to other people. They run the race that all saints run. But those who run life's race with small hearts quickly find that race is a constant struggle. Consequently, the eyes of the hearts of small-hearted people are short-sighted. They match the proportion of the territory they occupy with those hearts. They don't possess an expansive vision of much of anything. They don't have a very generous view of life. They obsess over all the little things in life. They constantly sweat the small stuff. They focus on the insignificant details. They major in the minors. Small-hearted, ungenerous saints always notice the speck in somebody else's eye. Never understanding as they go through life's race, it's the log in their own eye that obstructs the view of the goal that they should be pursuing, the finish line. Small-hearted saints run the same race as big-hearted saints. The only difference is the freedom the big-hearted saints enjoy while they run their race. I got to tell you, I've been to more than my share of waiting rooms in the hospital. And I've sat in there with families who had a family member who had a heart issue. And yes, I've sat in there when the surgeon comes in to tell them after they have done a stress test or a cath. I have to tell you that he or she only has about 35% or 25% of their heart that's actually functioning. Oh, it's like a light bulb goes off with the family. And they'll start saying things like, "Oh gosh, that explains why they were so tired all the time. Why, yes, that's why she couldn't walk out to the mailbox and even come back to the house. That's why they were so weary." I just wonder, how long has the master surgeon been trying to tell you and me the percentage that our spiritual hearts are functioning at? Oh my, that would explain a lot, wouldn't it? Something to think about for all saints on All Saints Sunday. We invite you now to prepare